Hello, everyone. Peter Maravellis here from City Lights. I'd like to welcome you to session 7 of the third day in the Revisions Festival. City Lights is honored to be working together with Gert Institute San Francisco and Gray Area in bringing together a network of activists, educators, critical theorists, designers, and programmers to present lectures, discussions, and workshops focusing on the ways in which technological bias shapes our cultural realities. Our goal is to explore new perspectives and develop new visions advocating for social justice and reclaiming power. The program spans over the course of a week. We have already had the pleasure of featuring an amazing lineup of speakers exploring a range of issues. As we wind down the lecture and interview side of the festival, it is not yet over. We have workshops lined up next week, so please check out the calendar of events to learn more. City Lights is greatly honored to be working alongside Gert Institute and Gray Area and helping bring you this remarkable program. Gert Institute San Francisco is the cultural arm of the Federal Republic of Germany. Their programs encourage intercultural dialogue and enable cultural involvement. They aim to strengthen and develop structures in civil society and foster worldwide mobility. It is a great pleasure to be working once again with Bettina Wodianka and her colleagues in bringing you this exciting program. The festival is part of a project called Image and Bias, which originated with Bettina and her colleagues, and that critically engages with the cultural realities being increasingly determined by imperceptible technologies. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to our friends at Gray Area. They are the perfect medium where something like revisions can really flourish. Gray Area is a cultural center and an educational hub located in San Francisco's Mission District. Their mission is to apply art and technology to create social and civic impact through education, incubation, and public events. They use digital tools to create art and design projects that benefit society. So I'd like to take a moment to thank Nadav Hochman and his amazing team at Gray Area for all their good work. And a very huge shout out to Matthew Chacon, who's been our tech wizard through the festival, making sure everything runs smoothly behind the scenes. We're ever grateful. It's been a pleasure working with Gray Area in the past, and City Lights is honored and thrilled to be working with them again on this really fantastic project. So this session is titled Living in Data. Joining us will be Jer Thorp in conversation with Romi Ron Morrison. Jer Thorp is an artist, a writer, and a teacher. He was the first data artist in residence at the New York Times. He is a National Geographic Explorer, and he has served as the innovator in residence at the Library of Congress from 2017 to 2018. He lives under the Manhattan Bridge with his family and his awesome dog, Trapper John, MD. Joining him will be Romi Ron Morrison. Romi Ron Morrison is a Black, queer, non-binary artist, researcher, and educator. Their work investigates the personal, political, ideological, and spatial boundaries of race, ethics, and social infrastructure within digital technologies. Using maps, data, sound, performance, and video, their installations center Black feminist technologies that challenge the demands of an increasingly quantified world, reducing land into property, people into digits, and knowledge into data. So today's session celebrates the release of a new book with a title that mirrors the name of the session. It is called Living in Data, A Citizen's Guide to a Better Information Future. It is written by Jer Thorp and published by MCD Books, which is a division of our friends over at Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. At the core of the book is the crucial question: how do we stop passively inhabiting data and instead become active citizens of it? This, of course, is central to much of what we've been discussing over the course of the last few days, so it makes sense that we really cap off the lecture part of the series with this talk. We will be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase the book. Our discussion will also be followed by a Q&A, so please post your questions and comments in the Q&A function of your dashboard. So, Jer Thorp, Romi Ron Morrison, welcome to the festival. It's a great honor to have you both with us. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, what a delight to be taking part of this event and to be speaking with Romi tonight. We've known each other for a few years and have spent now a few days scheming about this conversation, and I'm really excited to see where it goes. So we're gonna be talking about data, and thus like talking about records and the record. We'll be talking about histories and the history, narratives and the narrative. And I want to start out by just acknowledging that I'm with you from Brooklyn, which is the traditional and unceded lands of the Munsee Lenape people, as well as the Canarsie people, and that no meaningful discussion about any of the things that we're going to be talking about today or that have been discussed during this event can be had without the voices of Indigenous people and without sort of centering their values and worldviews. And we'll kind of come back to that, I think, a little bit later. But so my book starts, it starts on the banks of the Mississippi River. And I thought it would be good just to start by reading that prologue, and then we'll get into conversation. So I'm just gonna take a moment here to share my screen. Hal Fisk stood in the Louisiana sun, wiping the sweat from his brow with a clean white handkerchief. It was one of a few dozen that Emma always packed for him on these trips, for the sweat and for the mud. There was mud still in the deep furrows of his geologist's hands, even after he'd wiped them clean and then wiped them clean again. There was mud too, caked and dried up both of Hal's arms to where he'd rolled up his shirt sleeves neatly in the morning. To do any sort of work out here was to be very intimate with mud, no way around it. They'd been trying to get the bore rig started all morning, but the big bit kept on getting caught on something before it could build up enough torque. An old tree root, it turned out. So Bill Hendy was neck deep in the muck with a hacksaw trying to get the thing out. Hal hoped they would get the machine started soon. Around noontime, the heat would be downright unbearable. This was the second last drill between Harrisburg and Natchez, and he was eager to get back to Vicksburg, to Emma, to the lab, and to the data. Where Hal was standing was a good 10 miles from the Mississippi. There was another river that ran much closer, the Tensas. It was a stream, really, choked with turtle grass, half decent for fishing according to the locals, but barely wide enough for a boat even after a rain. What the mud would tell them, Hal knew, was that the Tensas was the meandering ghost of a Mississippi past, a last trickle of a course abandoned some 3,000 years before. It had been clear from the beginning to the first humans who had navigated the river that the Mississippi was restless. Over time, its curves would widen, the water becoming more shallow. Eventually, the elbows of the river would double back on themselves, and the water, taking what it deemed to be the most rational path, would decide to avoid the old part altogether, would flow across the ground to the next loop of the river, cutting off a piece of itself, and repeat. Evidence of this bending and rebending lives in the mud and in the life that sprang from it. A cut-off elbow of the river might spend a century or two as a stranded lake. During this time, it discards its riverine identity and becomes a closed system, something more still. Largemouth bass and quick silvery dace are replaced by languid long-nosed gar and deep burrowing catfish. At the river's edges, new plants arrive, more suited to the idle water of the lake. Year to year, decade to decade, they send their roots into the water to drink, and the soil builds around them. It's a drawn-out argument between land and water, one before it began. The water is consumed, and what is left is a lake-shaped mark of greenery growing on top of a lake-shaped layer of mud. From the sample they'd drawn today, and some 16,000 others, Hal and his team would reconstruct the river as it was. Some of the boreholes that the team drilled reached down more than 13,000 feet into the earth, and the rock there held evidence of the river's beginnings after the last great ice age, some 2.5 million years ago. From mud and rock and aerial photographs, they would draft maps of each of the river's abandoned curves, stacked on top of each other, a record of a huge, timeless, writhing thing. The result was a report delivered in 1944 titled Geological Investigation of the Alluvial Valley of the Lower Mississippi River. From all those columns of earth and images from airplanes, they built an epic geological story, one more complete than had ever been told. In the report, you can read of roaring glacial runoffs, of boulders carried across continents, of the Sunflower System, the Phoebe's Gap, the Walnut Bayou segment, the Gulf Coast geosyncline, of bed materials and bank recession and salt domes and uplifts. Fisk's work was a gargantuan feat of data collection, of synthesis and map making. From mud and patchwork photographs, he gave the river, with its school rhyme name, a 170-page origin story of a place, of a landscape, of a way of life. There were 200 copies of Fisk's report printed, and for $2.50 plus postage, it would be delivered to you. A compact book printed on white paper and 26 map plates neatly folded into quarters and tucked into brown paper envelope. One of the copies ended up at the New York Public Library, and a few months back, I went to the main branch in Bryant Park to visit it. Even though I'd seen images many times, when I unfolded the first plate onto one of the reading room's broad wooden tables, my heart skipped a beat. The maps are gorgeous, visceral things, rendered in a brilliant color palette of green and yellow and orange and red. And they're big. I could fit only 4 plates on a time on the 20-foot long table. To see the whole set of maps in one place, you'd need a hallway 108 feet long. Seeing that I was trying to get a photograph of the maps from above, one of the librarians brought out a stepladder, and I climbed to the top. It might have been vertigo. I'm not good with heights, but a kind of dizziness overtook me as I looked down into the 4 plates, onto a stretch of the river that spanned 2,400 miles and 10,000 years. For a moment, I saw a map of this book that you have in front of you, and I realized that the story I have to tell too is one of meanderings, of swift currents and slow corners, of silt and history. It's a story that has come to be in part by looking down from above, watching and listening and reading, spending hours in archives. Mostly, though, it has come from time spent waist deep in data, in research labs at the New York Times and the Library of Congress, on expedition with National Geographic field teams, in galleries at the Museum of Modern Art at the bottom of the ocean, in cities like Calgary and St. Louis and Manchester, and in the middle of Times Square. There was mud on my hands. There are 164 rivers that join the Mississippi on its 2,000-mile course from Lake Itasca to the Gulf of Mexico. The Languille, the Skokie, the Edwards, the Grant, the Iowa, the Missouri, West Branch Sugar River, and Hay Creek and Bayou Pierre. The biggest of these have their own tributaries. So to consider the river is to stretch from Montana to Pennsylvania, from Saskatchewan to New Orleans. Read about data in the newspaper, read about it online, and it might fool you. It might fool you into believing that the path we're on is a predetermined one, that the way in which we're being carried along its course is the only way we can go, that its history could be drawn in one clean line. To tell the real story of data, though, is to speak not only of the big topics, of Facebook and machine learning and targeted advertising and visualization and facial recognition. To get the whole picture, we need to visit the smallest creeks and brooks and streams, the places where the story bubbled up a century ago, and the places where we can find new stories just beginning to flow. Helen Hall Jennings sits in a classroom in Brooklyn in 1931, watching the students writing in her notebook. A 17-year-old in Cleveland dials into the nation's largest freenet. Outside a school in San Francisco in 1999, children plant 2 walnut saplings, identical clones. In a theater in Birmingham in 2003, a woman is on her hands and knees, carefully counting out 2,435 grains of rice. In the highlands of Angola in 2015, a convoy of mine-clearing vehicles rumbles through a pristine forest. On the north side of St. Louis, a group of 9th graders project census data onto a hand-drawn map. On a glacier high in the Canadian Rockies, a sensor records a sudden movement of the ice. There's no straight line to be drawn between these heres and theirs, these nows and thens. This book will by necessity meander. It will double back and reverse course. Step back though, climb up on a ladder, and I hope you'll see a bigger story. So I had these maps in my head for so long, and I know that this case, I share this with lots of designers because they're just such beautiful objects. But as I became to learn more about them, there was something else that sort of sat underneath them that I got excited about. And Romi, when I read, you have this amazing essay that begins with a kind of story about these maps, and I realized that there was a real symmetry of some of the ways we think about them. And maybe we need to start by asking you, what got these maps in your head? Because I just kind of read a few pages of what got them in my head, but I'd love to hear from you about it. how they got embedded.
Yeah, I mean, I think the simple and neat story is that they're overwhelmingly like robust and beautiful. And so just like aesthetically, I felt really drawn to them. I think the first time I encountered them was in this collection that Nato Thompson curated called Experimental Geography, I believe. But I think the real reason, the longer form answer, is really that there's such a celebration of air entry. And so often when I give a talk or try to introduce people to my work, I try to juxtapose the Harold Fisk maps with like the J.T. Lloyd 1862 maps, which, you know, really encompass, I think, the maybe more traditional ways that we come to understand rivers as they're being visualized on a map as a discrete kind of linear blue line. And I usually put them in juxtaposition because I'm really, you know, very curious about not only the ways that maps come to represent information, but then produce what we come to know as being, you know, kind of what the river is really, aside from something that is navigable or controlled, but something that is agential. And there's so much agency in looking to see all the circuitous paths that the alluvial sort of like patterns of the Mississippi have taken over time. And that Harold Fisk map just incorporates that so beautifully, and works both as, I think, a testament to what can be gleaned or understood from working with data, as well as understanding maybe like the limitations of what can't be encompassed or what can't be enclosed as well. So it tends to harness that kind of space really well, as a kind of like border that's a little bit more porous. It's not enclosed, not so discrete, but, you know, carries the line of both what we come to understand as well as making the border kind of clear as well.
You make a point which I hadn't really thought about when I looked at the maps, that what we would normally consider to be the most important piece of it is rendered a negative space. So yeah. the river as it existed when this survey was done is actually the ghost, and all of the things that are in the past feel much more visceral. And to me, that just reading that has become a really useful metaphor, because we, you know, as I spoke of, we have these ideas of not only where has data come from, but where it's going. And I think in all of many of our discussions and our critiques, that is the thing that's sort of inked so clearly. And the rest of the discussions, the rest of the topics, the rest of the kind of people who are excluded from some of those topics, the histories are ghosted. And you use this term, right, the unlevied bends, right? And I think there's an interesting place for us to arrive in. I think we'll get there by the end of this conversation, to think about what are those levees that are in place in the ways that we are encouraged to think about data, and how we might breach those levees, you know, how we might meaningfully flood out into different territory. And then, you know, another shared word that I'll put on the table, because I think it's important, is messiness. and you know, that you know, data and messiness are really far away in our cultural understanding. We think of data as something that's being very precise and clean, and it's not. And
or if it is, it requires a lot of labor for that to be the assumed state of it.
Right. Yeah. Right. And also it feels like there's always an urgency to clean. And I, you know, what I love about your work is I feel like there's actually a movement in the other direction, to actually purposely mess it up more. You know, so I'm thinking about your Decoding Possibilities project, which I think, so this is this project that you did in Boston that looks at the histories of a feminist collective called the Combahee River Collection, and you took kind of historical geographic traces and then overlaid them with redlining maps, and they're actually unreadable without a sort of facilitating reading that you could describe the project better than me, and I haven't seen it in person. But there's a forcing there of like of unreadability, which I find really interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, like, I think trying to connect some of the ways that you're talking about the Fisk maps to the Decoding Possibilities project, I would say that something that's really fascinating to me about showing the alluvial paths of the Mississippi is that it's very much a conversation about time and like what continues to haunt the kind of present course of the Mississippi, which to me is about residue, right? It's about like, what are the residual things that are informing the present, but that don't seem I don't know, don't seem relevant or don't seem very like visible or like extremely correlated. And it's interesting to think about the alluvial because an alluvium is really water and sediment and silt, right? It's not just that it's the flow of the river, it's that it's depositing silt and building up land formations for really important Black geographies like New Orleans, for example. So the richness of the Mississippi River as a delta is contributed to the residual sort of nature of soil that's flowing downriver and then collecting. And so when you dam the river, dam or levee the Mississippi, you start to allow for things like subsidence to happen. So a lot of the huge divots with regards to like sea level in New Orleans happen along those levees. So there's a lot of like beautiful poetics about residue and the alluvium. And so coming to the Decoding Possibilities project, or what you kind of articulated as messiness or making the map messy, I think is to try to allow for that residue to stay within the visuality of the map and not to like exercise it or to erase it, but to allow for the tensions that give the sort of historic residual tensions to stay in the visuality. And so with that project, it's trying to have this conversation primarily about race and about Blackness and about what it means to try and redress historic violence through the language of data, data visualization and mapping. And so redlining has become such a highly visible forum to talk about racial violence within space. And we look at the Hulk maps, which have a kind of seductive beauty to them, as well as being like really violent kind of geographies. And part of Decoding Possibilities was to try and maybe suspend the analysis of thinking about race just as a site of abjection within those maps, and instead to ask questions about what becomes unreadable or unknowable because of the overdetermination that data kind of has, particularly in the Hulk maps for visualizing Blackness as the kind of sites of violence, but instead to think about Blackness as a site of agency. And so looking at the archive, the Combahee River Collective, that's kind of like the layer beneath the contour lines of the redline geographies of Boston. And you start to see in these kind of alluvial formations how they were bringing together resources from lots of disparate groups in Boston at the time to essentially launch a project to ensure the safety of Black women in Boston in 1979. So it's about how to, in a similar way, looking at the Fisk alluvial maps, see the landscape as something that is agential rather than the site where levying or violence happens. So to see Blackness beyond just a site of abjection, or race as something as a site of abjection within the map, but as a particular geography that also is in response to violence versus just being overly determined by it.
It's interesting that you bring up the I don't remember the exact phrasing you used, but those redlining maps with their kind of, I would have maybe previously thought of those as like schoolroom colors,
Mm-hmm.
red and blue and yellow and green, although now we might think of them as Google colors, those kind of very bright, like primary maps. So we can you were talking, when you were talking about residue, I thought about this. So I'll talk about this project a little bit that I did in St. Louis, but I'll start with a bit of a tangent. That's that I'd spent, I don't know how many years. I started the project in 2013. I think I'd spent about 3 or 4 years there before I went across the river to East St. Louis, where the Cahokia Mounds are, so the Cahokia Mounds are remnants of an indigenous population, which at its height, which would have been around 1100 CE, the population of that place would have exceeded the population of London contemporaneously. And it's now these kind of very rounded hills. There's almost nothing left of them. And So anyway, that was my strange aside when you're talking about it. Some of that silt that's being carried down the river is the silt from these civilizations. And so anyway, so in St. Louis we did this project which I think I came to with a kind of innocence, which now looking back, so we had this idea that we would take over this abandoned gymnasium in a school in St. Louis North Side, and we would create a place where anybody could come in and author these 10-foot by 10-foot maps of their city and their lived experience, and then they would use those maps as instruments to read data. So we would project data layers on top of them. So there's something else kind of mapping and layering happening. And so there was, I came into that with a couple of problems that had always been in my head. And one was the complete asocialness of data, right? We experience data usually, in a newspaper or on our screen. It's a lonely thing. And I wanted to try to figure out ways that we could make the analysis of data a more social experience. And so, hence these 10-foot by 10-foot maps, which people would crawl on their hands and knees. And, at the same time, it feels like a very technical project, but it was one of the hardest sort of technical projects we had to work on to kind of get all the data layers to talk to each other. But one thing that we realized right away is so we have census data, for example, and in census data is rendered in these particular languages, these particular visual languages. So any layer that we wanted to place on top of the map, if we use the kind of default way that this was colored, the Black neighborhoods, the neighborhood that we were existing in for this project, would be in these deep reds, right? Like, because every one of those indexes was indexed from red to another, to green or to blue or whatever it is. And so one of the first things we had to redo it was like to remove that. And it made me think about how deeply inscribed that messaging is. And one of the core themes of the book is that the narrative structures that we've been given to understand data are all from Silicon Valley, from MIT, from Stanford University, and they don't have allowances to tell stories outside of this very narrow worldview. And I think that is seen in small things like that, and like what color is this map?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a really good example to talk about. That language and narrative can never be separated, I think, from what we would understand to be more somehow empirical or self-contained. Like earlier when we were talking about this conversation, I brought up Sylvia Wynter's work, who argues that science can never really be separated from the cosmogony in which it exists, meaning that the origin stories that we have for describing and narrativizing the world also then inform the ways that we approach science, scientific method, scientific discourse. And so those things are always somewhat ensnared. And rather than try to always neatly separate them, she would argue that it means that science as like a sort of biocentric practice needs to always be hybridly understood, read, and then kind of written within the capacity for language and narrative. And that's why I think your book is really interesting, because it's taking up really directly what it means to write the ways that we encounter, think, and speak about data within a different language, which is then to situate it within, a kind of different worldview or a different cosmogony outside of the narrow institutions of Silicon Valley, MIT, Stanford, or even going further back, like post-Enlightenment Europe, right? So there's this kind of broadening, I think, of how to hold different things in relation, allowing for that messiness or friction to remain, rather than, I think, isolating or treating data as like a mere universal.
Well, yeah, it's interesting that you end with that phrasing. So, in the second chapter of the book, one thing I do is kind of back up and talk about where the word data comes from. I think one of the huge challenges we have is that there's no common understanding of this word. And even amongst quote unquote data people, we don't share an understanding of what we're talking about. But that word, as I explained in the book, like arrived to us as a loan word from Latin, and it came from theology, where data was literally something that was given to us from God, and that people call it an objectivity, but we could kind of actually think about it as that this godliness of it continues and has continued since then, even though the word has become so tightly bound to computers, that feeling. So when I was in high school, we would be asked to solve an equation, right? And you would have things that you knew, and there were things that were unknown. And those things that we knew, we call a given, and that actually is exactly the same root. Those things are data, and so we still have this idea that. And it's an extremely powerful label to attach to something. Like if we attach the word data to something, then there's other words we could use. We could call it a measurement or a record or but that 4-letter word, like once we stick it to something, it has a power that's really hard to detach. And I had a conversation early this week with a folklorist, and I was actually really taken during the conversation by how far away those two concepts are. Like the idea of data and folk life are so far apart. And this is as a folklorist, somebody who studies like foodways, and so I started to think about the idea of dataways, right? Like that we don't interrogate, I think, enough. Like the day-to-day ways that ordinary people are experiencing data, as much as we interrogate ideas of algorithmic bias, and these ideas of machine bias are so entrenched in our idea of what the problem is. And part of the book actually is about saying, like, no, like there's a broader problem here, which is that all of us now, largely against our will, occupy data, and we don't have a good understanding or a permission to understand what it should be like to live in that place.
Yeah, and you asked me earlier about my thoughts about unknowability, and I think there's a relevance here in that, rather than, for me, I think continuing a kind of residue by which rationality is kind of made akin to ethics, which is a very post-Enlightenment idea of like the human. I think for me, unknowability actually provides a little bit more of a capaciousness for what it means to engage something. And that's why I love the Fisk maps, because it's not contained into something that's knowable and therefore predictable, that can be kind of seen as something that can be governed and maintained. And because it has a sense of agency, you have to be kind of in awe of it a little bit, because there's potential harm that could come to you if you don't treat it seriously. And I think that kind of unknowability, indeterminacy, then brings up questions of risk and what it means to engage in shared practices of risk versus a response to risk through like means of control or predictability. And so when we're talking about data or unknowability, for me, there is, I think, the potential for an ethic that comes from an understanding that I don't completely understand this thing. Therefore, I have to maintain some kind of inquisitive response to it, or curiosity. It isn't quite closed or contained, and therefore, even just in like pure act of self-preservation, I can't immediately just kind of like write it off or put it within like an overly reduced kind of capacity, in the ways that sometimes data indicators can kind of serve that function.
It feels to me, in looking at some of the work that you've been doing lately, and I think about this project that I think maybe last year you were working on in Los Angeles, where you would sort of engage in these meditative practices and then sort of go out into the city and collect. It was like a way of embodying data collection in a way that maybe embraces some of that. So you pick up these objects that I think are very evocative, but it feels like there's a resistance on your part try to categorize or classify them in ways that would maybe be instinctive for a kind of data, a more traditional data project?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some things that are just really hard to actually parse and to neatly separate. And I mean, as someone that has probably read more like critical race and sort of gender-based theory than I don't know if one ever should read. But so much of the premise is that it's things like what we come to understand as race or what we come to understand as gender or sexuality are not individual sort of like entities or components, but are always mutually constitutive. So the idea of like neatly separating them assumes a kind of like transparent universalism, right? Meaning that if I was to separate gender from race, the assumption is that, well, then gender not marked by race is whiteness. So there's not this ability, I think, to neatly parse things like this. And so in that project, Sedimentary Exits that you're referring to, I was really trying to read different types of data kind of against each other or in conjunction that aren't neatly parsed. So both reading, historic data about the constitution of the neighborhood in which I was living called Harvard Heights, which was very much started as early farm tract development suburb to downtown LA, founded under a restrictive covenant that set a minimum price for what homes could be sold as a kind of aspiration towards wealth and an aspiration towards property ownership and management. Literally, the street that I live on is called Oxford Avenue, Harvard Heights, right? These are like very aspirational titles around wealth. And the overwhelmingly typology of housing there are these like large single family kind of estates. And this neighborhood was historically preserved fairly recently within the last 11 years. And on it, there's a map of like both contributing and non-contributing members to the historic preservation. And the non-contributing are the multifamily apartments and the contributing are these single family estates. So very much wealth is being articulated through a kind of metric of home ownership and of value. And at the same time, I was walking literally the bounds of the neighborhood and then noticing that the social life was really hard to just like visibly see. And so in lieu of that, what I would find are these residues of discarded clothing or like personal artifacts that were reminiscent of bodies or social activity that I couldn't see just walking the neighborhood. So trying to read this kind of archive that I'm collecting alongside, the clarity of property, sort of like wealth or value as a way to think about what this neighborhood is, and to move back and forth across these different ways of, collecting or kind of like archiving information, and not to like neatly parse them as being different, but to think about different entry points into how we think about value. So property value versus like social activity, for example, and to kind of stay in the tension of reading those things simultaneously.
There's a way that we talked about messiness already, but now we're bringing this concept of entanglement, and these messy, entangled things frustrate computational systems, right? There's an interview in the book with a developer from the New York Times named Jacob Harris, who talks about, so he built the original database for the Guantanamo docket. And so you come up with this database that is meant to hold these stories, but then the stories change and the database can't, there's a tangle in it now, and the tangle can't pass into the database. And so you have to rewrite the database to meet that tangle. And then later another tangle comes. And so to me, that was really, really interesting to get to the bottom of something which I've experienced as a kind of computational data practitioner, which is that you do kind of kludge things together to try to to hold back that, you are kind of levying against this tide of complexiness and messiness that you never can really, you're never going to be able to beat, but there's that instinct that's like a required task of computation, is that it's a battle, between these two things.
I think it's interesting to think about what it would mean to make that labor like more explicit with the output that then is being visualized, because I think then you have a more complete picture, at least about the explicit acts of things like interpretation, processing, like interoperability. Like none of those things are axiomatic or just happen. But again, it is this question, not just of like the labor that is required to allow for that, but then you have a fuller picture of how something like a visualization, is simultaneously producing knowledge as much as it's visualizing it. Like visualization is almost a misnomer there a little bit. And so it then never removes those kinds of questions of, human agency or responsibility. I think that's where the moments of responsibility become clear in that kind of labor, because there is a sort of creative license, I think, for what it means to clean data, and usually with a prerogative of some kind. And so keeping those things somewhat visible, I think, as a part of the ultimate visualization that is created is I think an interesting premise, or having those kinds of receipts is a practice I would love to just see more.
Well, uncertainty is the grand challenge of visualization, and it's a challenge that has not been solved in any sort of way that feels sufficient.
Mm-hmm.
But that also again speaks to, I write about this in the book, is that one of the reasons why I got tired of visualization was that kind of pervasive sort of belief in its sort of, and can go back and call it a sacred ability to like tell the truth and to tell it neatly in a way that I think is actually, it's fundamentally authoritarian, first of all, right? Mm-hmm. Like to be a data visualizer is to play the role of the authority. And I also, just got frustrated by the lack of space there. And so that's, I think, why I started working with performers, for example, with sculpture, with sound, with participatory practice, was actually that all of those things provided a kind of better means of communicating that kind of messiness. And that again is an underlying message of this book, is that there's a huge amount of room to be speaking about data and to be telling data in ways that not only are not sort of dependent on large scale computation, but are actually kind of better exercised by people who right now aren't expected to be data tellers.
Yeah, and I think you're speaking to things like affect. I mean, you're speaking to relation. There's a relation in seeing. There's a relationship between listener and sound, or there's a relationship between like observer and performer. Like those things are. It's easier to invite people, I think, into that space. You have a little bit more agency as someone that's like curating or constructing that project, versus I think something like a visualization, which then is often detached from creator and kind of circulates outside of your capacity. But I think there's also something really interesting in thinking about time, because often in the the kind of game of data visualization, what is created at a particular time is a snapshot, but then the way that gets interpreted is often divorced from a kind of temporality, right? It's meant to just be everlasting or evergreen until it needs to be redressed or retooled. And so the like product of the visualization versus the labor that it takes to constantly work and rework data are somewhat divorced. And I like the ways that you're reflecting on time and visualization through the One Tree project, or some of these other sort of modalities of thinking about what it means to think of indicators as an endurance, maybe more so than this kind of evergreen, encapsulated, static representation.
Yeah, so those of you who are in San Francisco, if you read the book, you'll read about this project that was started in 1999, where the artist designer Natalie Jeremijenko planted a series of pairs of cloned walnut trees with the idea that these walnut trees, who are all genetically identical, in the ways that they grow over time, would tell some story about the environmental conditions and the social conditions of the city, which I just thought was such a beautiful idea. But then, in classic media art form, every documentation of that project is broken. Like nothing exists, and so it became a kind of detective story to find out, where these trees are. But what really always caught me about that project, and it's a project that had been stuck in my head for longer than a decade because I couldn't kind of get rid of it. Was kind of what you're talking about. We expect not only to be able to take these complex things and reduce them to like something that appears on your screen, but we also expect them to be able to tell that story in 30 seconds.
Yeah.
And when I think about like these problems like climate change, for example, there's another piece I talk about in the book, which is a permanent piece we have installed in Calgary, which is meant to sort of exist over a period of decades. And that like what does that type of time period afford us? And some of these ideas are like feel like they're a little out of range of kind of day-to-day activity. But one of the assignments I always give my students when they're trying to think of a thesis idea or an idea for the class is to greatly expand the time frame. Like what happens if you try to do what you're trying to do, but to do it over a day or even over an hour. But if you expand these things. We're running out of time, and I want to get to something because I think it's important to talk about. But you briefly mentioned that part of the end of the book is a series of conversations I had with Maui Hudson and Tahu Kukutai, who are part of the Maori Indigenous sovereignty movement. And I could go on about this because I think it's really fascinating. But maybe I'll just pick a piece of it that we can talk about. There's a paper that was written that takes this classic data, information, knowledge, wisdom pyramid, which I'm sure we've all seen, and tries to reimagine it in the Maori worldview. And what they come up with is the kind of thinking of it as not like this kind of funneling device, but more as a prism, as something that you can like take an idea or a piece of thinking and kind of shine through, and they describe it as a prism that privileges wisdom. And I love that idea. And the thing that I really love about it is that they really are clear in the book that every community, if I can use that word, despite its kind of problematics, can wield its own prism. And that actually to understand something to understand something fully is to direct that your questions through more than one prism.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is, I think, the space that's really exciting for me, maybe that I would love to see more space given to, rather than maybe just conversations about bias, because bias seems to be situated within a kind of singular worldview. And the assumption is that as individuals, we're going to mitigate how much of like this worldview we've ingested, and then somehow that's the side of the corrective. And that has never made much sense to me. And I think also for people that maybe find themselves in more liminal positions to that worldview, i.e. people that do not embody a certain type of like white cis heterosexuality, male sort of like prototype, that it allows for, I think, the bringing in for other worldviews, other lenses, other prisms that need to be held in relation to like the assumed cleanliness or universalism, I think, of where conversations around data often reside. And there's something that is vital about what kind of relationship or responsibilities I think emerge within that kind of space, rather than assuming that we're going to somehow have a corrective within the worldview that yields certain logics that then justify certain violences. And coming back to our conversation on like errantry or messiness, like Edouard Glissant in Poetics of Relation would say that there is no totality that will ever be reconcilable, but rather through acts of errantry or encounter, or these kind of like multiple lenses or multiple prisms, there's like modes of exchange that allow for that totality to be, it allows us to embrace the irreconcilability of it and find like the poetics of relation alongside. And that's always a really beautiful way, I think, for me to think about how to engage some of these conversations, so that the goal isn't to make everything knowable and discrete in totality, but it is this errant process of encounter. And sort of bringing the ethics of encounter into those types of relationships.
We have been using the word "we" a lot, and I write in the foreword to the book about how hard that was for me to like encompass but I borrowed this phrasing from Julieta Singh about like the necessity of "we" as a kind of hopeful summons. And I think that's a valuable way of using "we." But we also, I think we continually have to think, especially in the data context, of breaking "we" apart, and it's a very powerful word for Silicon Valley, because they can wrap the kind of needs and desires of everybody under a kind of the shiny Apple "we," and that's something that I would encourage sort of anybody who's thinking about this hard task of thinking critically about data, is to break up their own "we" into pieces and try to look through those separate prisms when you're thinking about these things, and not just your own, and that obviously that goes double, triple, quadruple fold for white cis hetero men like me, like that shattering is necessary.
Yeah, I mean, it's a politics that I think understands the capacious necessity of difference, right? Versus I think, and that difference is maybe like the modality upon which to understand what is common or what's possible as a commonality, rather than assuming the commonality from the get-go. And I think there's something about learning to engage maybe the discomfort of difference that in it can hold a more lasting, I think, understanding of ethics, rather than approaching it from the opposite, approaching it from an assumption of like the assumption that we already have certain things in common, and therefore we're just going to act without making explicit responsibilities clear. But I think this embracing of difference as a reparative politic is really exciting.
This was an awesome conversation. I really enjoyed it. And I wish we could talk for longer, but I think we should maybe bring in questions if we have some questions. Hey, Peter, there's Peter, just right on call.
So please, everybody, post your questions and comments. I would like to start off maybe with, what was invoked for me. I love the fact that you mentioned messiness. And somehow Donna Haraway came to mind, and thinking a lot about her treatise, Staying with the Trouble, and the ways in which that had explored, ways in which we reconfigure our relationships to Earth and its inhabitants. So what I'd like to put forth maybe is, can we consider how our relationship to data can be tied into such a reframing of our worldviews? I mean, data rhymes with data. And so I'd like to also invoke the spirits of liberatory currents, a situationism, Black Lives Matter, Occupy, in this inquiry. I mean, if Octavia Butler could have a conversation with, say, someone like David Graeber or Bachelard, I mean, in a kind of an alternative great beyond, what would it sound like?
I mean, it would be, I would listen. That's for sure. I think that phrase, sort of staying with the trouble, is valuable. And I guess the way that it makes me think about, from a really linear perspective, I think about one of the things I'm hoping to do in the book is to change what people think about when they think about data, from being those numbers falling down the screen on the matrix to being a system, right? So it's like we have this collection, and then we can call it computation. It's this kind of squishing and parsing, and then you have this telling, and a lot has been done creatively on the telling side. And I think we need to invite more people to work at the points of collection, but then also at this kind of molding and moving stage of the process, which feels like owned by computer scientists, but isn't necessarily so, I don't think. And that's what I come out of that sort of asking is, when I tell people I'm a data artist, I feel like they sort of hear sandwich artist in some way, that like I'm like making these kind of beautiful things with data. And I think, as artists or as writers or as poets or thinkers, we need to get downstream. We need to be working, and I think those more important points of the system.
Yeah, there's Denise Ferreira de Silva has this article called "Difference Without Separability" that I find really intriguing. And in it, she's giving a very short snapshot of like post-Enlightenment European thought. And one of the things that she kind of uses as an idiom to describe it is efficient causality, which I think is something that very much informs how we interpret or understand data, as a kind of efficient causality. And towards the end of the article, she's trying to argue for what she calls difference without separability, meaning that that kind of efficient causality emerges within a worldview that sees things within an ordered whole of different components that are intrinsically separate or different. And because of that separability, there's a lack of staying with the trouble. There's a lack of kinship in the way that Haraway is talking about it in that text, because we no longer then bear an ethical responsibility of what is intrinsically different, but we understand them as being irreconcilable. And so difference becomes like a distancing agent, rather than it becomes, a way to, I think, query that question of like, what responsibilities or ethics do we owe to each other? And so in your question, what I'm hearing is, what is the potential for engaging data from the space of difference without separability, or what kind of like knowledge making then is possible in that space? And I don't know that I can answer that question, but what I can say is that I find a lot of really promising content from the ways that certain Black studies scholars like Shaka McLaden or Catherine McKittrick or Sylvia Winter or Denise Ferreira de Silva or Alexis Pauline Gumbs are thinking about things like computation, or thinking about things like data, and I think are really trying to stay in the social relationality of information rather than that kind of efficient causality. And so there's something promising there, because it gives us not only a different language, but a different politic and worldview from which to approach questions of data that don't assume that it's already this question of like axiomatic, integers that we need to that is the space of the problematic that needs attention. It's more, what is the worldview that has constructed this understanding of data as universal, and therefore what other lenses or prisms kind of counteract that. And so I find a lot of promise in that kind of scholarship, or in those kinds of like investigations and queries.
Yeah, you have this nice term about that, like space between the integers, and I think if I wanted to like settle on anything, it would be just to kind of revisit this idea of messiness. Julieta Singh talks about like this messiness that we have to risk if we are to act differently in and toward the world. And I think that sort of it's together some of our discussion, brings like risk back into the picture.
Yeah, I think that's a big one.
Messiness can be mistaken sometimes, in these terms for, well, first of all, it's a bad word for data people, the idea of messiness but yeah, my brain has now gotten too messy to finish the sentence.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to another question. Yeah. Wilson asks, is there a representation of nature in data that illustrates its gift economy, or is it impossible to articulate nature in numbers without missing ineffable, vital elements?
That's a really good question. I've actually been thinking about this a lot because I'm a birder. I've become a real serious birder. And birding is a process of, well, so first of all, birders don't like the term bird watching. There's like bird watching, you'll be like, no, I'm not a bird watcher. I'm a birder. And part of what birding encompasses is counting, right? So the enumeration of these animals is the sort of at the root of birding, and people will keep these, like, very accurate life lists of what they've seen, and so these beautiful feathered things that are in possession of indescribable beauty get like turned into a check mark or into a number, and that distillation of these animals into numbers is really valuable scientifically, but I think it loses something that can be irretrievable. And I've been working a lot with bird data. I taught a class last term at NYU called How to Count Birds, which is about bird data. And a lot of what we're asking is I think what the question was about is like, is there a way to do that reduction while maintaining some of the sublime? And I don't have a good answer for that. It's really something I've been really wrestling with. And from a personal perspective, that sort of it sort of happens in two ways. It's like I have to force myself sometimes when I go out with my binoculars to like not keep a checklist, to force myself like to resist that active enumeration. And the other thing is that I've been working on some visualizations and to understand how to build in some of what I personally feel when I see a bird into that visualization. And I think that's also, I don't write about birds much in this book, but this book was 10 years of me also trying to ask the same question, like how do we balance the kind of incessant appetite for reduction that comes with data processes with like our really human need, and to acknowledge beauty and complexity and messiness.
Yeah, I think there's something you get at in the book, and I'm blanking on the project, but it's the rice visualization.
Yeah.
What's the name of? Can you
of all the people in all the world by Stanscaf.
And in your conversation, you're near the end of it, you're speaking about how inevitably, observers of this visualization of race to, try to make something like innumeracy, I don't know, just like more relevant for people or more personalized, that people always find Aaron Rice somewhere, and they personify the race as if it is a person, right? So it's like these people are lost, or they've been separated from the group, and so there's something.
They'll come with that grain of rice held gently in their hand and be like, I found this.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's that piece like really sits with me for that reason. It does, it's a magic trick that we need to understand how to do more.
Yeah, so there's something about innumeracy being something that has the potential for affect, right? And that often is attributed affect, even though it's not always made explicit. Like Jer, in one of our earlier conversations in prepping for this, we were talking about Michelle Murphy's book, The Economization of Life, and she has this term phantasmogram within it, because she's speaking about GDP and aggregate data, and then the kind of like affective narrative stories and attachments that are placed on something like GDP, not as just a figure, but as something that denotes the health of a nation, that denotes like anxieties, fears. And so I think there's a lot about integers and numeracy overall that still operates in an affective register. And I think the rice piece that you're kind of bringing attention to, it makes that affect really explicit as a form of communication, so that the number doesn't just stay as a digit, doesn't just stay as something in isolation, but allows for the affective to kind of live beside it.
Yeah, it's worth saying, just in the last piece of response to that is that's a project done by a theater group, right? They don't come. It's accidentally a data project. And I think that's the reason why it works so well, is they come with all of the experience and intent of creating something human in a space rather than counting numbers.
This really evokes the poem of the late surrealist poet Philip Lamantia called Ornithology as a Form of Yoga. He had found birding to be almost like a visceral pursuit that was really filling him with, a lot of personal satisfaction. It had, just a great, almost a personal spiritual kind of content. This has been such a rich conversation, and sadly, we're out of time. But thank you both so much for this wonderful gift. We're ever grateful and so happy you could have been part of this. I'd like to encourage everybody. We've posted links in the chat function with which you can purchase copies of Living in Data. Also, what are you guys going to be working on in the near future? I think we'd all love to hear a little bit more about just upcoming projects, anything we should know about.
Yeah, I can jump in. So this will be a busy summer. I have 2 artist residencies that will facilitate working on 2 different projects that I have. One through Transmediale, working with a collaborator, Mimi Onoha, who's another fantastically brilliant artist who thinks and works with data often. We're working in the book, yes. The Library of Missing Data Sets is a fantastic piece by her. And we're working together building this archive that's thinking about quotidian acts of care, Blackness, futurity, and what it means to enact an archive through correspondence. And then separately through Culture Lab, which is kind of spread across LA and New York, I have a year-long residency with them developing this project called the Future Conditional, which is looking at histories of Black diasporic movement and socio-technical infrastructures for sharing very site-specific information through quotes and through the freedom quotes in particular.
Yeah, I've been working on a really utilitarian project for like the last 6 years, sort of in line with the more sort of artworky type projects, which is called Field Kit. And the reason why we built that is we realized that the act of collecting data, and especially environmental data, is gate kept in all kinds of ways. It's expensive, first of all, but it usually requires like lots of technical know-how to do it. And the result of that is that the people who are out collecting data are like of a specific type. and so FieldKit is to try to make that cheaper and easier. So if you go to fieldkit.org, you can actually order these things now. And it's a way for, we're really thinking about teachers in classrooms, but also environmental activists, people who maybe can't afford a $10,000 environmental station that can collect the right time of data that you need to like bring to a courthouse or to make really actionable. So that's like that's the nuts and bolts kind of work that I've been focusing on in the last little while. So hopefully people get a chance to check that out.
Well, we look forward to crossing your paths again in the not too distant. Jer Thorp, Romi Ron Morrison, thanks so much for joining us. It's been an honor to host you both. I'd like to let everyone know, there is more to come in the festival. So please visit the Revisions web portal to learn more. Our next event's going to be on Wednesday, June the 16th. It's called Understanding AI Data Bias, and it's going to be moderated by members of the Intelligent Museum, a practice-based research and development project at the ZKM Center for Art and Media Karlsruhe in the German Museum. So also I'd like to let you know that tonight's talk will be rebroadcast on Gray Area website in the near future. So if you know anyone who missed this talk, or if you'd like to see it again, please check it out. This event has been co-sponsored by the City Lights Foundation, which is a 501c nonprofit, carrying on the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti. The City Lights Foundation fosters an active engagement with books and literary culture. Our public events, publishing program, and educational outreach are dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So thank you all again for joining us. We hope to see you all again soon. Please be well, everyone.